Greetings, and thank you for your interest in my book, which is about an Afro-Caribbean in the Nazi era. The Afro-Caribbean is the gentleman in this picture. His name was Lionel Romney, and he was my father. My name is Mary Romney. In this presentation, I'm going to be talking about where and when my father lived. Then I'll outline my father's World War II experience, followed by some brief background on the Nazi era and Mauthausen, which was the concentration camp where he was imprisoned. And then in his own words, you will hear him talking about his experience at Mauthausen. I'll say a word about his survival. I'll discuss trauma and healing, and I will conclude with why I wrote my book about my father's wartime experience. So again, this is my father's name, Lionel Romney. This is when he lived and his life in geographical terms. Rather than explain it in detail, I'll just say that number 1 is meant to represent the Dutch side of the Caribbean island of St. Martin, which is where my father was from. And number 2 is meant to represent Aruba, Curacao, and Venezuela, which are 3 more places where my father lived in his pre-war life. So now I'm going to outline his World War II experience as he told it to me in his oral history. The oral history that I recorded with my father was the source of the information in my book. Now, as a civilian, he was a sailor on cargo ships sailing between the Caribbean, North America, and Europe from the mid-1930s to 1940. In June 1940, he was aboard the SS Makis, which was a Greek merchant ship sailing through the Mediterranean from Wales on its way to Greece. That ship was mined. As you know, a mine is an explosive device, and it sank. But the crew was rescued by the Italian Navy. So when the Italian Navy rescued them somewhere in these waters, that was how my father became a political prisoner in Italy. So for the next 4 years, he was transferred through a series of internment camps there in Italy until 1944, when he was deported from this area of Italy to the Mauthausen concentration camp in Italy, which is just about there. And he remained as a prisoner there until the camp was liberated by the US Army at the end of the war. So now I'd like to say a word about Mauthausen within the context of the concentration camp system. As you know, there were different kinds of concentration camps. There were death camps, also known as extermination camps. There were labor camps, there were prison camps, there were women's camps, there were transit camps. However, Mauthausen was the only camp that was specifically designated to work its prisoners to death. It was the only so-called death through work camp. About 200,000 people were imprisoned there over the life of the camp. These included people from all the groups that the Nazis specifically targeted for extermination. And those were Jews, Roma and Sinti, Slavic peoples, the handicapped, criminals, Jehovah's Witnesses, communists, political opponents, and LGBTQ. So the prisoner population there was very diverse, with every country in Europe being represented and every continent. About 90,000 people were worked to death, tortured to death, starved to death, and died in other ways. My father witnessed the destruction of human life every day that he was at Mauthausen, which was almost a year. He was always wondering if he would be next. The result was that he was deeply traumatized by his experience there, so much so that he was virtually silent about it for over 40 years. But finally, in 1989, he opened up and began to talk about it. I never thought he would because it had taken me over 20 years to get him to talk about it. So I want to play a few minutes of his very first conversation about his internment at Mauthausen. This is from the first oral history interview we ever had together. And this excerpt is a bit less than 3 minutes.
And so then, after the war, where were you when the war ended?
I was in a camp in Austria.
In Austria, not in Germany.
No, in Germany, in Austria.
In
we
Austria.
came in from Italy. They took us to Austria.
By train.
Yeah, cattle, what the hell you call it?
A cattle car.
Yeah, cattle car.
Yeah.
Everybody, what a bundle in there.
And where in Austria?
We're up in the place is near to Graz. That's a concentration camp, one of those notorious concentration camps by Mauthausen. It's up on a hill. They had the crematorium and the camps, you know. The barracks like thing, you know, so many people in the barracks. So we were liberated in 1945, the 10th of May.
10th of May.
1945. About a couple of days before Hitler died.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Huh. Huh, that's interesting.
We were liberated by the Fifth Army, the American Fifth Army.
A couple of days afterwards?
A couple of days before Hitler died.
Did you ever have any close calls?
Were you ever in, what kind of danger would you say you were in during that time?
Oh, every day was dangerous. There wasn't a day that wasn't, you know, considered. Sometimes you said, so how the hell are they going to get out of here? And then we heard some of the, you know, different things from the atrocities of the Germans was committing in the camps. Before they leave, they kill everybody.
Right.
See if they have to run away. But we were up close to the place in Austria where we were. It was close to the Czechoslovakian border.
Uh-huh.
You can hear the Russian cannonading, and you can hear the concussion from the artillery, you know.
Oh, yeah.
But how did you survive? This was one of the first questions I asked my father when he talked about his experience. He never answered this question, but I know that there were a few reasons why he survived. But perhaps the main reason for his survival was because of his languages. Prisoners with language skills were often allowed to live longer than others because they could serve as interpreters. So my father spoke all of these languages, and there were a lot of prisoners in Mauthausen who spoke all of these European languages. So he was able to communicate with a lot of people. One of his nicknames was the translator. The subtitle of my book, which is From Papiamentu to German, pays tribute to the role of languages in my father's survival. Even though he did survive, my father was deeply traumatized. However, oral history may have played a part in helping him to heal. So I'd like to read a passage from my book that addresses the healing power of speaking about trauma. In the absence of words, the survivor perpetually endures past trauma as present experience, but words allow him to relegate the past to its proper place. Words bring him to a safe space. And I think that's what happened to my father during our oral history interviews. Now, in the same way that oral history was healing for my father, my experience at Mauthausen and then writing the book brought peace to me. So again, reading from my book, visiting Mauthausen finally brought me to a place of peace with my father's experience there. Although he was a victim of the Nazis, he was also a victor. His victory was in his survival. Knowing this, I can gratefully be at peace. I wrote that book about my father's experience for a few reasons. Among them are that I wanted to weave another thread into the tapestry of African diaspora history in order to help complete the picture, because so much of it is missing. We as African diaspora people have to take control of and responsibility for our own narrative. It's because others have appropriated our narrative for so many centuries that we have not been in control of it. And oral history helps us take that control. Also, I wanted my book to be an example of how everyone has participated in or been a witness to historical events. And I wanted my book to serve as an example to others and encourage them to pursue oral histories with their families. So in closing, I would like to say that my father's oral history is the basis of my book about his World War II experiences and my visits to Mauthausen. My father's experience is an example of a story that only came to light because of oral history. I hope that my experience with oral history will encourage you and others to embark on oral history projects with your families and members of your communities. Thank you very much.